What makes a boy become famous so fast that the world mistakes speed for destiny? And what happens when that same speed starts to feel less like blessing and more like a warning? Before the investigations, before the headlines turned ugly, before Darren Wang's name started carrying the weight of scandal, he was the kind of young star audiences fall for almost instantly. Not because he looked safe, but because he didn't. There was always something slightly reckless in his image, a little too loose, a little too charming, a little too alive to feel fully under control. That was the appeal, and maybe that was also the danger. Darren Wang, born Wang Dalu in Taipei in 1991, did not rise through the polished, carefully managed route that makes a celebrity feel distant and untouchable. He entered the industry young, working in television before the public really knew what to do with his face. He made his acting debut in 2008, then kept moving through smaller projects, building a career long before most people would later remember his name, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. The sudden rise came later. The groundwork came first. That matters. Because stars like Darren are often remembered backward. People see the explosion and assume the beginning must have looked just as bright, but usually it doesn't. Usually it looks uncertain, unformed, full of waiting, full of a young man trying on visibility before he knows whether it will become a life or just a brief interruption before ordinary reality returns. Darren's early years in the industry had that shape. Not myth, not certainty, but motion. He kept going, kept appearing, kept moving close enough to recognition that the possibility of fame never fully left him. So who was he before the public really locked onto him? Not a scandal yet, not a symbol yet, just a young actor with a face that looked built for impact. And some faces are dangerous like that. They make audiences feel they understand a person before they know anything real about him. Darren had that kind of face, the kind that can look boyish and rebellious in the same breath. Warm enough to invite attention, restless enough to keep it. He did not feel like a traditional good boy star. He felt more unpredictable than that, like someone who could be romantic one second and reckless the next. Viewers are drawn to that energy because it feels alive. But energy like that also creates a public image very early, sometimes before a person is old enough to control it. Do you know what that means? It means the audience starts writing your personality for you. It decides you are wild, free, dangerous, magnetic. It confuses screen presence with destiny and charisma with character. And once that happens, the real person has to live under the pressure of an image he did not fully build alone. That is the real beginning of Darren Wang's story. Not fame itself, but the making of a young man whose appeal always carried a little instability inside it. A future star with too much momentum to remain ordinary, and maybe too much rawness to ever look fully safe once the spotlight got brighter. And when the spotlight finally did get brighter, it would not just reveal him. It would magnify everything. Then came the film that changed everything, not because it was subtle, not because it was prestigious, but because it did exactly what breakthrough roles are supposed to do when they hit at the right moment. It took a face people had noticed before and turned it into a feeling they could not escape. For Darren Wang, that film was Our Times. And once it arrived, the public stopped looking at him like just another young actor trying to break through. It started looking at him like a phenomenon. That is what made the moment so powerful. Because Our Times did not make Darren famous in a cold, distant way. It made him emotionally available to the audience. He was not just visible, he was crush-worthy, memorable. The kind of male lead people did not simply watch, but immediately project onto. There was swagger in the performance, yes, but there was also softness underneath it. And that combination is always dangerous when it lands right. A little rebellion, a little vulnerability, a face that looks like trouble, but not the kind you run from too fast. That is exactly how stars get made. Before that film, Darren had momentum. After it, he had an image. And once an actor gets an image that strong, the career changes shape. It is no longer just about whether he can act. It becomes about what he now represents to the audience. In Darren's case, he became the boy who looked rough around the edges, but still felt emotionally reachable. Not polished enough to be boring, not dark enough to be threatening, just unstable enough to feel exciting. That is a very specific kind of stardom, and it is one the camera loves. But let me ask you something. What do people really fall for in a breakout role like that? The performance itself, or the illusion that the actor and the character are sharing the same pulse? Because that illusion followed Darren everywhere after Our Times. The role did not just make him more famous, it locked him into a kind of public energy. He became the guy people expected to feel a little wild, a little impulsive, a little too charming to ever be fully safe. That image worked because he wore it so naturally. Or maybe because he made it look natural enough that no one wanted to question it. And that is where things get interesting, because breakthrough roles are gifts, but they are also traps. They hand an actor attention, but they also hand him a cage built from expectation. Once the world has decided how you make it feel, it does not want that feeling taken away. It wants you to keep giving it the same charge, the same danger, the same chemistry, the same emotional weather. Darren's success in Our Times did not just prove he could lead a hit. It created a version of him the audience was eager to believe in. The trouble is, those versions can get too close to real life, especially when the image already carries a little instability inside it. And maybe that was the hidden tension in Darren Wang's rise all along. The role that made him beloved also made him harder to separate from the idea of being impulsive, magnetic, and slightly out of control. On screen, that looked irresistible. In the real world, that same energy would not always feel so easy to love. That is why Our Times matters so much in his story. It was not just the moment he became famous, it was the moment the public decided what kind of man Darren Wang was supposed to be, and started watching him as if that image might one day spill off the screen. Then the image turned ugly. Not messy in the glamorous celebrity way, not romantic chaotic, not the kind of trouble fans can excuse as, he's just wild, ugly. Because what happened to Darren Wang did not feel like one careless scandal. It felt like the kind of story that changes the air around a person, the kind that makes people stop talking about charisma and start talking about character. And that is always the most dangerous turn for a star whose appeal was built on looking a little reckless, a little untamed, a little too alive to be boring. At first, the damage came through the military service issue, and in Taiwan, that is never a small thing. Because military service is not just paperwork there, it is tied to duty, masculinity, fairness, and public resentment toward anyone who looks rich or famous enough to think the rules should bend for them. So the moment Darren's name became linked to allegations of using fake medical documents to avoid conscription, the story instantly turned colder. This was no longer about a charming bad boy image, it was about entitlement. About whether a man the public had helped elevate thought he could live above obligations other people still had to face. That alone would have been enough to crack an image. But then the story got worse. Much worse. Because while authorities were already looking into the conscription case, another investigation pulled Darren into something far dirtier. Allegations that he had instructed someone to attack a driver after an argument. Suddenly the atmosphere changed from embarrassment to menace. It was not only that he had been accused of trying to escape a duty, now he was being dragged into a story that felt more violent, more vindictive, more disturbing. And once those two things collided, the public no longer saw separate incidents. It saw a pattern. That is what destroys celebrity the fastest. Not one mistake, not one bad headline, but the feeling that every new accusation is confirming a darker version of the person people were already starting to fear might be real. So let me ask you something. What happens when the same wild energy that once made a star attractive starts looking dangerous instead? What happens when the edge that sold the fantasy stops feeling cinematic and starts feeling criminal. That is exactly where Darren Wang's story became hard to control, because the public was no longer deciding whether it liked him. It was deciding whether it had misread him from the beginning. Was he always just a magnetic actor with a rebellious image? Or had that image hidden something more reckless, more impulsive, more rotten than people wanted to admit? Once the questions shift like that, every old photo changes meaning. Every smile looks different. Every performance starts to feel haunted by the life outside the screen. And maybe that was the real collapse. Not just that Darren got pulled into scandal, but that the public stopped seeing him as a star who happened to get into trouble and started seeing him as trouble itself. That is a much harder image to survive, because audiences can forgive a romantic bad boy. They do not forgive easily when the bad boy starts looking real. Factual backbone. Darren Wang was investigated in 2025 over alleged military service evasion using forged documents, later pleaded guilty to document forgery, and was also investigated over allegations he arranged an assault on a driver after a dispute. So what is Darren Wang now? Not the boy people fell for, not the reckless heartthrob frozen inside a hit romance, not even just a scandal-ridden celebrity caught in a bad year. He is something more uncomfortable than that. He is a question. Because once a public figure is pulled through this kind of story, the damage is never only legal, it is emotional, visual, atmospheric. People stop looking at the face the same way, they stop hearing the name the same way. And that may be the hardest part of what Darren Wang is living through now. The old image has not simply cracked, it has been contaminated. That is what makes endings like this so cold. There is no clean tragedy here, no beautiful downfall, no easy redemption arc waiting politely around the corner. There is only a young man who once benefited from looking a little wild, a little dangerous, a little hard to tame, and now has to live with what happens when that energy no longer feels attractive, but threatening. The fantasy changed, and once fantasy changes, fame changes with it. Can the public still see the actor, or is it now trapped looking only at the scandal? That is the real problem. Darren's talent, his screen presence, the very thing that first made people lock onto him, none of that disappears overnight. But it no longer arrives untouched. Every future performance risks being watched through the shadow of what happened outside the frame. The audience does not come in empty anymore. It comes in already suspicious, already carrying headlines, already wondering whether the man on screen and the man off screen were never as separate as they once wanted to believe. And that is a brutal way to continue a career, because comebacks are simple only in articles. In real life, they are haunted, even if the cameras return, even if the work returns, even if the public eventually grows quieter. Something has shifted at a deeper level. Darren Wang is no longer just a movie star with a strong face and dangerous charm. He is now a figure the public has to negotiate with morally. That changes everything. It changes how people remember the rise. It changes how they read the smile. It changes how much grace they are willing to offer. Maybe that is the final truth of his story. He did not lose only control of the narrative. He lost the safety of being consumed as fantasy. And for a star like him, that may be the deepest fall of all. Because stars built on polish can sometimes survive scandal by becoming colder, more distant, more protected. But Darren Wang was never built that way. His appeal came from feeling immediate, a little reckless, a little alive, a little too close to the edge, and now that same edge has turned against him. The thing that once gave him electricity now gives the public a reason to doubt him. So this is not really the story of a bad boy becoming more dangerous. It is the story of what happens when the image people loved for feeling thrilling suddenly starts feeling unsafe to believe in. And maybe that is where Darren Wang stands now, not at the end, not at the beginning, but in the worst place a star can be. Still recognizable, still famous, still impossible to ignore, but no longer easy to romanticize. factual backbone. In 2025, Darren Wang was investigated over alleged military service evasion, later pleaded guilty to document forgery, and was also investigated over allegations he arranged an assault on a driver.